January 1945, Battle of Bastogne. Captain Thomas Doyle had gone 48 hours without sleep. The cold was -20 degrees. Extreme hunger. His men were collapsing. He could have allowed them to rest. He could have waited for conditions to improve. He could have prioritized comfort and immediate survival. But Doyle knew something brutal. If they stopped now, they would never rise again. So he forced the march. He ignored pleas. He suppressed his own exhaustion. He placed discipline above all else. 12 men hated him at that moment. But 9 survived because a captain understood that discipline doesn't negotiate with circumstances. 80 years later, you still prioritize comfort and wonder why your life is ruined. Thomas Doyle's son found his diaries in a locked metal box in the basement 2 years after his death. Among accounts of frozen battles and impossible decisions, one page was torn and rewritten multiple times. The date, January 17, 1945. Doyle had written and erased the same sentence dozens of times until finally leaving it. Today I learned that discipline is not what you do when you can. It's what you do when you can't anymore. When every fiber of your body begs for a pause, for rest, for surrender. There, in that moment of total collapse, you choose between being an ordinary human being or a soldier, between existing or commanding, between a mediocre life or an exceptional life. You will discover why putting discipline first is not about strength. It's about survival. On that freezing January night in 1945, when Captain Thomas Doyle forced his men to keep marching despite utter exhaustion, he wasn't being cruel. He was applying a principle he had learned the hard way. 3 weeks earlier, during another battle, Doyle had allowed a unit to rest because they were tired. It seemed a humane, compassionate, reasonable decision. 6 hours later, a German counterattack found them asleep. 22 men died without ever waking up. Doyle carried that. Guilt for the rest of his life. But he also carried the lesson. Discipline is not a luxury for when you feel strong. It's a survival tool for when you're completely broken. It's precisely when you can't go on that you need to force yourself to continue, because the enemy doesn't wait for you to be rested. Life doesn't wait for you to be ready. And if you prioritize comfort over discipline, you're not being kind to yourself. You're condemning yourself to defeat. In the diaries his son found, decades later, Doyle wrote a reflection that would completely change anyone's understanding of priorities. He said, "I realized that every man has an internal hierarchy of values. Some put security first, others put approval, others put comfort. And this hierarchy determines absolutely everything. Because when the situation gets tough, you don't act based on intention. You act based on real priority. If comfort is your number one priority, you will choose comfort over growth. If approval is your priority, you will choose validation over authenticity. If security is your priority, you will choose stagnation over necessary risk. And you will die living a small life because your priorities were wrong from the start." Doyle understood that the only priority that works on the battlefield is discipline, because all other priorities eventually kill you. Comfort leaves you unprepared. Approval makes you dependent. Security makes you weak. Only discipline keeps you alive and functional, regardless of the circumstances. You live with an inverted hierarchy of priorities. You put comfort before discipline. You put desire before necessity. You put feeling before action. And you wonder why your life doesn't work, why you can't keep commitments to yourself, why promises you make at night are broken in the morning, why plans that seem solid crumble at the first sign of discomfort. The answer is simple and brutal. Your priorities are wrong, and wrong priorities lead to wrong decisions. And wrong decisions lead to the wrong life. It's not complicated. It's not a mystery. You simply put the wrong things first, and now you're reaping the inevitable consequences. Doyle saw soldiers die not because they were weak, but because they prioritized the wrong things. They prioritized not feeling pain over completing the mission. They prioritized not bothering anyone over doing the right thing. They prioritized looking good over being good, and they paid with their lives. The transformation Doyle experienced after that night where 22 men died was radical. He decided that discipline would be the absolute priority, above comfort, above feelings, above desires, above everything. And this didn't mean being a robot or suppressing humanity. It meant recognizing that without discipline as a foundation, nothing else works. Love without discipline becomes dependence. Dreams without discipline become fantasies. Faith without discipline becomes superstition. Intelligence without discipline becomes waste. Doyle learned that you can have all the capabilities in the world, but if you don't have the discipline to apply them consistently, especially when you don't want to, then you have nothing. And this truth applied in war and applies in life. The only difference is that in war, lack of discipline kills you quickly. In modern life, it kills you slowly, but the end result is the same: total destruction. Now pay close attention, soldier. Captain Doyle learned this lesson the hard way. 22 men died so that he would understand that discipline doesn't negotiate with circumstances. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It doesn't ask for permission. If this message resonates with you, if you recognize that your priorities are inverted, if you understand that you need to enforce discipline first and foremost, even when every cell in your body resists, then leave your like now. Don't abandon Doyle on this mission. Each like is a soldier, acknowledging that discipline comes before comfort, before willpower, before everything. Leave your like and declare that you understand the hierarchy that keeps men alive and functional even when everything crumbles around them. 2 weeks before that fatal forced march, Doyle was overseeing a defensive position when he saw something that deeply disturbed him. A soldier named Private Robert Hayes, 23 years old, a good marksman, reliable. Hayes was on night watch duty. Doyle passed his position at 2 in the morning. Hayes was sitting, leaning against the trench, eyes closed, not fast asleep but resting. When he heard Doyle approaching, he opened his eyes quickly and said, "Captain, I was just resting my eyes for a second. I'm still alert." Doyle said nothing at that moment. He just observed. 3 nights later, a German attack came exactly on Hayes's position. He didn't see it. He didn't alert anyone. 7 men died before they could respond. Hayes survived but never recovered psychologically. Doyle wrote in his diary, "He chose momentary comfort over absolute discipline, and that choice cost 7 lives. But the most terrifying truth is that I understand perfectly why he did it. Because we all want rest. We all want to lighten the load, and that's exactly where comfort transforms from an ally into a killer." What Doyle realized that night is that comfort is not neutral. It is an active force that constantly works against discipline. It is not merely the absence of discomfort. It is a seductive presence that whispers justifications, that offers reasonable excuses, that convinces you that you deserve a break, that no one will know, that this time it won't make a difference. Hayes wasn't lazy. He wasn't incompetent. He wasn't a coward. He simply allowed comfort to become a priority for 3 seconds. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in that microscopic moment where comfort was placed before discipline, the fate of 7 men was sealed. Doyle understood that you can't negotiate with comfort. You can't allow just a little, because comfort operates like an addiction. You give in once and it becomes easier to give in the next time. You justify one exception and create a precedent for 1,000 exceptions. You put discipline in second place for a moment, and it never regains first place. You live this dynamic every day without realizing its lethality. You prioritize comfort over discipline in the morning when you negotiate with the alarm clock. You prioritize comfort over discipline at work when you choose easy tasks over important ones. You prioritize comfort over discipline at night when you eat what you shouldn't, watch things that waste time, and postpone what needs to be done. And every time you do this, you think it's an isolated decision, that it has no real consequence, that you'll compensate tomorrow, but you're training a deep neural pattern. You're teaching your brain that comfort wins when it confronts discipline. You're building the identity of someone who prioritizes feeling good over doing good. And this pattern accumulates, it strengthens, it becomes automatic, until you reach 30, 40, 50 years old and realize that you've built your entire life based on choosing comfort. And now you live with the accumulated consequences of decades of wrong priorities. Doyle began implementing a brutal protocol after that night. Every soldier under his command had to do something uncomfortable every day on purpose. Not because the mission demanded it, but because discipline demanded it. Waking up 15 minutes earlier than necessary, working extra shifts when it wasn't mandatory, maintaining perfect posture when no one was looking, cleaning their weapon for the third time even though it was already clean. These were small actions, seemingly without immediate tactical purpose, but Doyle knew what he was doing. He was training the men to prioritize discipline over comfort as an automatic reflex. He was creating mental muscle that operated independently of will, and the soldiers hated it. They complained, they questioned, they thought it unnecessary, until real battle arrived, and they realized they were the only ones who didn't freeze under pressure, the only ones who performed even when exhausted, the only ones who maintained standards even when everything fell apart, because they had trained to prioritize discipline when it didn't matter, and now they could do it when everything mattered. February 1945. Doyle was coordinating a rescue operation for wounded soldiers behind enemy lines. He had 3 simultaneous objectives: recover the wounded, maintain a defensive position, and prepare a counterattack. One of his lieutenants, Lieutenant Charles Mercer, approached him and asked, "Captain, which should we prioritize? It seems impossible to do all 3 things well at the same time." Doyle looked at him and replied with something Mercer never forgot. "You're asking the wrong question. It's not about which objective to prioritize. It's about which foundation to prioritize. If we put discipline first, we can accomplish all 3. If we put anything else first, we fail at all 3. Soldiers want to prioritize safety. Result: nobody acts and everyone dies. Others want to prioritize efficiency. Result: they cut corners and fail. Discipline is not an objective. It is the foundation that allows you to achieve all objectives. And you can't balance foundation with other things. Foundation comes first, or the whole building collapses. The trap that destroys most people isn't consciously choosing the wrong priorities. It's believing they can balance multiple priorities equally. Believing they can put discipline, comfort, approval, and security all first depending on the situation. This seems like flexibility. It seems like maturity. It seems like wisdom. But it's fatal inconsistency, because in moments of real pressure, when you need to choose between discipline and comfort, between discipline and approval, between discipline and security, you will choose based on your true priority. Not the one you say you have, the one you actually have. Doyle saw this happen repeatedly. Soldiers who said they valued discipline, but in critical moments chose comfort. Leaders who said they prioritized the mission, but in decisive moments chose the approval of their subordinates. Commanders who said they focused on victory, but in moments of risk chose personal security. And they all justified it as balance, flexibility, adaptation, when in reality it was just a lack of a clear hierarchy of values. You operate under this illusion every day. You say discipline is important, but when discipline confronts comfort in the morning, comfort wins. You say growth is a priority, but when growth confronts career security, security wins. You say authenticity is fundamental, but when authenticity confronts social approval, approval wins. And you call this balance. You call it being human. You call it intelligent adaptation. But it's just a confusion of values disguised as flexibility. It's an absence of clear hierarchy disguised as open-mindedness. And the result is a life where you never really advance in anything, because you're constantly negotiating between conflicting priorities. Doyle understood that effective soldiers weren't those who balanced everything. They were those who had a crystal clear hierarchy. Discipline first, always, without exception, and everything else naturally organized itself below that. The true test of priorities doesn't come when things are easy. It comes when you're exhausted, when you're afraid, when you're in pain, when no one is watching, when you can justify an exception. There, in that moment of maximum pressure and minimum supervision, your true hierarchy of values emerges. And if discipline isn't so firmly at the top that you don't even need to think about it, then you fail. Doyle constantly tested this. He created situations where soldiers had to choose between comfort and discipline with no time to rationalize, between approval and discipline with no room for negotiation, between security and discipline with no opportunity to justify. And he observed. Those who hesitated revealed a flawed hierarchy. Those who acted immediately revealed a correct foundation. It wasn't a test of moral character. It was a test of internal programming, of which value truly commanded when all the masks fell. The brutal truth that Doyle discovered is that you cannot serve two masters. You cannot place discipline and comfort on the same level of priority. One will win, and if it's not discipline, then you've built a foundation on sand. And when the storm comes, and it always does, everything crumbles, because comfort sustains nothing under pressure. Approval holds nothing together when you're alone. Security protects nothing when real risk appears. Only discipline remains functional regardless of circumstances. Only discipline continues to operate when everything else has failed. And if you haven't placed discipline so absolutely first that it doesn't even question it, then you have no foundation. You only have good intentions that crumble at the first real test. March 1945. Doyle's unit had been surrounded for 3 days. Low ammunition, dwindling food, morale shattered. He could see in the men's eyes that they had internally given up. They still followed orders mechanically, but the will to fight had evaporated. One of the sergeants, Sergeant Daniel Briggs, a reliable veteran, approached Doyle and said in a low voice, "Captain, the men can't go on anymore. They need real rest. They need hope. They need to feel that it's worth continuing." Doyle remained silent for a long moment. Then he replied with something that echoed in Briggs' mind until the end of his life. "Sergeant, when you wait to feel like fighting, you've already lost the war. When you wait for circumstances to improve before applying discipline, you've already surrendered. Discipline isn't what you do when you can. It's what you force yourself to do when you can't anymore. And the key word is force, not inspire, not motivate, not convince, force. Because the moment everything falls apart, the only thing that remains functional is brutal discipline that doesn't negotiate with feelings. The great illusion of modern culture is that change should be organic, that discipline should be natural, that you should wait until you feel like acting. This works when things are easy, when you are rested, motivated, and resourced. But when you are broken, exhausted, and without options, this philosophy kills you, because you will never feel like it. You will never be naturally motivated. You will never wake up inspired. And if you wait for those feelings, you simply don't act. And not acting at a critical moment is a decision to die slowly. Doyle understood that forcing yourself is not violence against yourself. It is a realistic recognition that your mind will betray you when you need it most. It will offer 1,000 reasons to give up. It will paint a picture where surrender seems reasonable. It will convince you that you have already done enough. And if you listen to these arguments, you are finished. You face this every day but don't recognize it as a life or death struggle. In the morning, when you need to get up, your mind offers perfectly logical arguments to stay in bed. You're tired. You deserve rest. 5 minutes won't make a difference. And if you wait until you feel like getting up, you won't. You have to force yourself. At work, when you have to do a difficult task, your mind presents a compelling case to postpone it. You're not in the ideal mental state. Tomorrow you'll be more prepared. Other things are more urgent now. And if you wait for natural inspiration, you procrastinate. You have to force yourself. At night, when you need to do what you planned, your mind perfectly justifies why. Today can be an exception. You've already worked hard. You deserve to relax. One day won't ruin everything. And if you wait for spontaneous motivation, you give in. You have to force yourself. Doyle implemented a simple but brutal protocol that night of the siege. He told the sergeants, "Don't ask the men if they can. Don't wait for them to want to. Order and ensure execution. Because in the state they're in, if you ask them, they'll say they can't. And they'll believe it. But if you force them, they'll find out they can. Not because they're stronger, but because discipline doesn't depend on strength. It depends on a refusal to negotiate." And it worked. Men who swore they couldn't take another step marched for 8 hours. Men who said they were at their limit held their position for 2 more days, not because they were motivated, but because they were forced to discover that the limits they believed were merely limits their minds had invented to protect their comfort. The truth that saves lives but wounds egos is that you are far more capable than you believe, but you only discover this when you are pushed beyond the point where you would normally give up. Doyle saw this hundreds of times, soldiers convinced they couldn't do something, forced to do it anyway, and then realizing that what they thought was their absolute limit was just fear disguised as realism. The human body and mind have an absurd capacity to continue functioning far beyond the point where you think you can't anymore. But you never discover this if you wait until you feel you can. You only discover it when you push yourself despite feeling you can't. And it is in that moment of pushing against all the internal signals telling you to stop that you cease to be an ordinary person and become a soldier. Listen up, soldier. Captain Doyle is trying to teach you that forcing yourself isn't cruelty. It's a realistic recognition of how human functioning operates under pressure. If you understand that, expecting willpower is expecting defeat. If you recognize that you need to force yourself precisely when you least want to, then subscribe to this channel now. Join the battalion of people who have decided to prioritize discipline through force, not inspiration. Doyle needs you to do this. Subscribe and declare that you will force yourself to act, even when every fiber of your being begs you to stop. April 1945. The war was drawing to a close, but Doyle sensed something unsettling in the men who had survived. They were beginning to relax, they were beginning to negotiate, they were beginning to think, I've survived this far, I can loosen up a bit now. And Doyle saw exactly when that thought entered each soldier's mind. He saw it in their posture. He saw it in their attentiveness. He saw it in their execution. A soldier named Corporal Edward Cole, who had been impeccable for 6 months, began arriving 2 minutes late for briefings. He began cleaning his weapon less carefully. He began checking his position less frequently. These were microscopic deviations no one else noticed, but Doyle did, and he pulled Cole aside for a private conversation. He asked what was going on. Cole replied, "Captain, I'm just tired. I thought I could relax a little now that we're almost at the end." Doyle looked at him and said, "Soldier, you don't relax a little. You completely collapse. Because there is no such thing as small-time negotiation with discipline. There is only surrender disguised as flexibility." 3 days later, during a routine operation that should have been simple, Cole was hit because he didn't check the perimeter with his usual attention. He survived but lost his left leg. Doyle visited him in the hospital, and Cole was crying. Not because of his leg, he was crying because he understood the price of negotiation. He said, "Captain, I thought it was just a little. I thought 2 minutes of delay didn't matter, that cleaning the weapon a little faster didn't make a difference. That checking position with a little less care was acceptable. But each small negotiation trained me to negotiate the next one, and when the moment that mattered arrived, I was operating in relaxed mode, and I paid the price." Doyle wrote that in his journal with devastating reflection. "I saw a man lose a leg because he negotiated with discipline in areas that seemed unimportant. And I realized that this is the pattern that destroys everyone. It's not the big betrayals. It's the small daily negotiations that accumulate until you no longer recognize what was the pattern. You're living through this process of degeneration right now. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be undisciplined. It was a gradual process of small negotiations. First, you allowed your alarm to ring twice instead of once. It seemed harmless. Then, you allowed yourself to skip the gym once because you were tired. It seemed reasonable. Then, you allowed yourself to eat something you shouldn't. Because it was a difficult day, it seemed justifiable. And each small negotiation trained you for the next bigger negotiation. Each exception you allowed became a precedent for the next exception. Each time you prioritized comfort over discipline in a small area, you strengthened the pattern of prioritizing comfort over discipline in all areas. And now you look at your life and wonder how you got here, how you became so out of control, how you lost so much ground. And the answer is simple and brutal. You negotiated daily, in small decisions that seemed insignificant, and these negotiations accumulated into total collapse. Doyle understood that discipline doesn't allow for negotiation because negotiation is a virus that spreads. You can't be disciplined in some areas and relaxed in others, because relaxation contaminates everything. If you negotiate with an alarm in the morning, you'll negotiate with an appointment in the afternoon. If you negotiate with food, you'll negotiate with work. If you negotiate in an area that seems unimportant, you're training a pattern that will operate in an area that matters everything. Discipline needs to be absolute, or it's not discipline. It's just temporary behavior that you maintain when convenient and abandon when uncomfortable. And this kind of false discipline is worse than the absence of discipline, because it creates an illusion of control while you are constantly losing ground. The only way to maintain functional discipline is to make it non-negotiable in all areas, all the time. without justified exceptions, without compassionate flexibility, without reasonable adaptation, because every exception you allow today becomes an expectation tomorrow. Every negotiation you accept now becomes the norm later. Doyle applied this brutally to himself. He didn't negotiate with morning routines. He didn't negotiate with standards he established. He didn't negotiate with commitments he made, and it wasn't because he was stronger than others. It was because he understood that strength isn't the issue. Negotiation is. If you allow negotiation, strength doesn't matter. You will eventually yield. But if you make discipline absolutely non-negotiable, strength becomes irrelevant. You simply do it, not because you want to, but because there is no option not to. May 1945, the day the war in Europe officially ended. Celebrations everywhere. Soldiers weeping with relief, embraces, explosive joy. But Doyle stood there, observing, everything with a grave expression. A young soldier, Private George Baker, noticed and approached him. He asked, "Captain, why aren't you celebrating? We survived. It's over." Doyle looked at him for a long time before replying, "Soldier, do you think you survived because you were lucky? Because God protected you? Because you were stronger than those who died?" Baker was confused. Doyle continued, "You survived because you maintained discipline, even when you felt incapable, even when you were sure you were going to die, even when every emotion screamed at you to give up. And now you think you can relax because the war is over. But the real war is beginning. The war of maintaining discipline when there is no visible enemy forcing you, when there are no immediate consequences, when you have to choose discipline over feelings every day without anyone forcing you." What Doyle was trying to teach Baker was a truth most people never learn. Discipline is not the result of feeling strong. It is the cause of becoming strong. You don't wait to feel capable and then act with discipline. You act with discipline and then become capable. Order matters absolutely, because if you wait to feel you can, you never begin. Your mind will always convince you that you're not ready yet, not strong enough yet, don't have what you need yet. And while you wait to feel capable, years pass, decades pass, a whole life passes. Doyle saw soldiers who waited to feel brave before acting bravely. And those soldiers died waiting. Meanwhile, soldiers who acted despite feeling terrified developed courage through action. Emotion followed behavior, never the other way around. You're trapped in this fatal inversion right now. You wait to feel motivated before you start. You wait to feel confident before you try. You wait to feel strong before you act forcefully. And while you wait for these feelings, they never come. Because feelings don't magically appear. They are generated by action. You don't wake up motivated. You act, and action generates motivation. You don't develop confidence by thinking. You act repeatedly, and repeated action generates confidence. You don't feel strong by standing still. You force yourself to act despite feeling weak, and that makes you strong. The sequence that works is always the same. Discipline first, action second, feeling third. But you live in the inverted sequence, waiting for feeling first, which never comes, so you never act, so you never develop. Discipline. Doyle implemented a simple protocol with new soldiers. When they arrived saying they didn't feel prepared, he would reply, "Good, nobody feels prepared. Preparedness isn't a feeling. It's a state you achieve by acting without feeling prepared." When they said they didn't feel brave, he would reply, "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear, and you only develop that by acting when you're afraid." When they said they didn't feel capable, he would reply, "Capability doesn't come before action. It comes through action. You act incapable until you become capable." And he forced them to act immediately. He didn't give them time to wait to feel different, because he knew that if he gave them time, they would never feel it, and they would never act, and they would never become capable. The most radical transformation that discipline provides isn't making you feel better. It's making you function regardless of how you feel. It's transforming you from someone who only acts when emotions cooperate into someone who acts independently of emotions. And that's not suppressing humanity. It's maturing beyond being a slave to your own feelings. It's recognizing that emotions are information, not commands. They are data about your internal state, not dictates about your actions. Doyle reached the point where he felt terrified, but acted calmly. He felt exhausted, but executed perfectly. He felt hopeless, but led confidently, not because he was emotionally stronger, but because he had placed discipline so absolutely first that feelings became irrelevant to action. Now listen up, soldier. Captain Doyle survived the most brutal war in history, not because he felt strong, but because he acted with discipline even when he felt completely broken. If you understand that waiting to feel capable is waiting forever, if you recognize that you need to act first and feel later, then leave your like now. Don't abandon Doyle in this mission to teach that discipline comes before feelings. Always leave your like and declare that you will act regardless of how you feel, that you will put discipline first even when every emotion screams otherwise. June 1945. Doyle was in a field hospital visiting wounded soldiers when he encountered a military chaplain, Lieutenant Henry Carter, sitting alone reading the Bible. Doyle approached and Carter asked, "Captain, may I ask a difficult question?" Doyle nodded. Carter continued, "Do you pray?" Doyle replied, "Every day." Carter then asked, "And what do you ask God for?" Doyle thought for a moment and said, "I don't ask for anything. I give thanks. I thank Him for giving me the ability to choose, to act, to maintain discipline, and then I ask for strength to honor those abilities, because it would be an insult to God to ask Him to do for me what He has already enabled me to do for myself." Carter was surprised. He said, "Most men pray asking God to take away suffering, to change circumstances, to make things easier." Doyle replied, "And these men are asking God to undo the gift He gave them, the gift of free will, the ability to choose discipline over comfort, the power to force themselves to do right when everything screams to do wrong." What Doyle was articulating was a theology of responsibility that most religious people avoid. The belief that God created you with specific abilities and expects you to use them, especially when it's difficult. That praying for Him to remove challenges is praying for Him to treat you like an incapable child instead of a mature son. That true faith is not about constantly asking for intervention, but about being grateful for the tools given and then using them brutally. Carter asked, "But what about when you can't anymore, when discipline seems impossible?" Doyle replied, "That's exactly when God expects you to keep going, because anyone can have discipline when it's easy, but maintaining discipline when it's impossible is when you prove you understood the gift you received. It's not about you being strong enough. It's about you honoring the abilities God placed within you by forcing yourself to use them when everything says not to. You may be using faith as an excuse to avoid discipline, praying for God to change your circumstances when He has already given you everything you need to change yourself, asking for signs when He has already given you discernment, expecting miracles when He has already given you free will, and calling this humility, surrender, trust. But it is merely spiritual laziness disguised as virtue. It is a refusal to take responsibility for the abilities received. Doyle believed that God cared much more about him using the discipline he received than about him praying for more motivation. That honoring the Creator meant making the most of the tools the Creator provided, and that putting discipline first was not pride. It was recognition that you were created with the capacity for self-discipline, and wasting that capacity was rejecting a divine gift. Carter and Doyle had several conversations after that one, and Carter began preaching something radically different to the troops. He started saying, "God doesn't want your excuses. He wants your discipline. He doesn't want to hear why you can't. He wants to see you pushing yourself even when you think you can't, because He created you with the capacity to go far beyond what you believe to be your limit. And every time you give up before reaching that point, you're telling Him that the gift wasn't good enough." This was controversial. Some soldiers thought it was too harsh. Others thought it denied the need for grace. But those who understood were completely transformed. They stopped praying for God to make things easier and began praying for strength to do the difficult things. They stopped waiting for divine intervention and began using divinely received abilities. Doyle lived the rest of his life with this theology of action. He believed that God looked at him every morning expecting him to put discipline first, that every moment he forced himself to do the difficult was an act of worship, that every time he chose discipline over comfort, he was saying, "I understand the gift, I will honor it." I will not waste it waiting for you to do for me what you have already given me the ability to do. And he died at 86 with that conviction intact. At the funeral, Carter, who became a pastor, said, "Doyle understood that serving God doesn't mean being passive. It means being brutally active, using everything he has given you. And he used it. Until the last day, until the last moment. No excuses, no exceptions. Just discipline first as the highest form of gratitude." August 1946. Doyle had been back in the United States for a year. Civilian life, no war, no enemies, no immediate consequences for lack of discipline. And for the first time since joining the army, he felt a real temptation to relax. He woke up one morning at 7 instead of 5. Nobody knew, nobody cared. There was no briefing, no mission, there was no objective reason to wake up at 5. But Doyle lay staring at the ceiling for 15 minutes, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. He felt he was betraying himself, not because waking up at 7 was morally wrong, but because he had prioritized discipline for 3 years under threat of death. And now, with no external threat, he was ready to abandon it all. He got up immediately and wrote in his diary, "I discovered today that the real war wasn't in Europe. It was inside me. And now that there's no external enemy forcing me to be disciplined, I need to push myself even harder, because discipline maintained under pressure is easy. Discipline maintained without pressure is character." What Doyle was discovering was a truth that destroys most veterans and most people in general. Discipline under external pressure is not real discipline. It's only temporary obedience. Real discipline is revealed when all external pressure is removed, and you still choose to put discipline first. Doyle saw veterans returning home and completely collapsing within 6 months. Men who had been exemplary soldiers became alcoholics, unemployed, broken, not because the war broke them, but because they never internalized discipline. They only obeyed external pressure, and when the pressure was removed, nothing remained. There was no internal foundation, just conditioned behavior that disappeared as soon as the conditioning stopped. You live this now without realizing it. You can maintain discipline when there's a deadline, when there are immediate consequences, when someone is watching. But as soon as the pressure is removed, you collapse. You work hard when the boss is present. You relax when he leaves. You eat well when someone is supervising you. You eat poorly when you're alone. You keep promises when there are witnesses. You break them when no one is watching. And this reveals that you lack discipline. You only fear consequences. And fear of consequences doesn't sustain you for life, because eventually you find areas where there are no visible consequences, where no one is watching, where you can justify an exception. And there, in that silent test, you fail, because discipline was never internal. It was only external. Doyle created a protocol for himself after that morning. Every week he had to do something disciplined that no one would know about, that would have no consequence if he didn't do it, that wouldn't visibly benefit him. Waking up at 5 when he could sleep until 7, running 5 kilometers when no one expected it, maintaining military standards at home where no one was watching. And at first it was torture, because his mind offered perfect arguments. Why do it when no one demands it? Why maintain standards when there's no inspection? Why be disciplined when you can be comfortable without consequences? And Doyle answered these arguments with brutal truth, because if I'm only disciplined when someone is forcing me, then I'm not disciplined. I'm just obedient, and obedience without an observer is nothing. Years later, in 1952, Doyle was working as a military instructor, and a young lieutenant asked, "Sir, how do you maintain discipline after so many years? How do you not relax?" Doyle replied with a story the lieutenant never forgot. 7 years ago, I woke up one morning and nobody knew if I would wake up at 5 or 9. Nobody cared. There were no real consequences. And I realized that that was the moment that defined everything, because anyone can be disciplined when there's a gun pointed at their head. But being disciplined when there's no gun, when there's no observer, when there's no visible reward that separates the soldier from the civilian. And I decided at that moment that I would maintain discipline not because someone demanded it, but because I demanded it of myself. And every morning since then, I wake up, knowing that nobody will know if I woke up at 5 or not. March 1986. Captain Thomas Doyle was 89 years old. He lay in a hospital bed, his body ravaged by cancer. His son was beside him, holding his hand. Doyle could barely speak, but asked for paper and pen. With a trembling hand, he wrote the last entry in the diary he had kept for 41 years. He wrote, "Tomorrow I will die. Doctors said so today, and I'm thinking about the whole journey. I survived the most brutal war in history. I saw men die for lack of discipline. I saw others survive by putting discipline before everything else. And now, at the end, I realize that the lesson hasn't changed. Discipline is still the difference between living well and dying badly, between honoring the life you received and wasting it. I have no regrets, not because I did everything right, but because I put discipline first even when I failed at everything else, and that gave me a life worth living." He died at 4. In the morning the next day, he woke up at 5 for the last time, because discipline doesn't negotiate, not even with death. When the son found those diaries months later and began to read them, something broke inside him. He had lived 43 years, putting comfort first, choosing easy over right, postponing discipline until tomorrow. And he realized he was wasting exactly what his father had honored. He realized he had all the skills, all the resources, all the opportunities his father never had. But he lacked the one thing that mattered. He didn't put discipline first, and he was paying the price. Mediocre life, superficial relationships, stagnant career, deteriorating health, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he didn't force himself to do it, because he negotiated, because he waited to feel like it, because he put everything before discipline and wondered why nothing worked. You are at that same point of choice right now. You can continue as you are, putting comfort, approval, security, feelings, desires, everything before discipline, and you can live like that until you die. Many do. They exist for decades without ever truly living. They die at 80, having wasted 80 years. Or you can do what Doyle did on that frozen January morning in 1945. You can simply decide that discipline comes first, always. No justified exceptions, no compassionate negotiations, no reasonable flexibility. First, above all else, and then force yourself to live according to that decision every day for the rest of your life. It won't be easy, it won't be comfortable, it won't be popular, but it will be real, it will be honest, it will be alive. Doyle spent 41 years proving that putting discipline first isn't about being perfect. It's about being consistent. It's not about never failing. It's about getting up and pushing yourself again every time you fail. It's not about eliminating emotions. It's about acting independently of them. It's not about being a machine. It's about being a human being who chooses to honor the abilities he's been given instead of wasting them. And he died without regrets, not because he lived perfectly, but because he lived with discipline. He put discipline before comfort, before approval, before security, before feelings, before everything. And that created a life worth every sacrifice. The question that defines your existence isn't whether you want to change. It's whether you're willing to put discipline first in order to change. Whether you're willing to push yourself when every cell in your body begs for a break. Whether you're willing to act without feeling the urge. Whether you're willing to maintain standards without an observer. Whether you're willing to honor the abilities you've been given even when no one forces you to. Because if you're not willing to do that, then everything else is just fantasy. It's just beautiful intention that never materializes. It's just another story of a wasted life, waiting for the perfect moment that never comes. Soldier, this is your last order from Captain Doyle. Do not abandon the mission he dedicated his entire life to teaching. Leave a like now, declaring that you understand that discipline comes first. Subscribe to this channel, joining the battalion of people who have decided to stop negotiating and start living with brutal discipline. And leave a comment telling us which part of this message impacted you the most, helping this channel bring more stories of soldiers like Doyle who paid in blood for lessons that can save your life today. Do it now, because Doyle died putting discipline first. The question is, will you live putting discipline first, or will you die having put everything before it? Answer now. Honestly, what is your true number one priority? Comfort, approval, security, or discipline? And if it's not discipline, are you willing to pay the price of living your whole life putting the wrong thing first?